The text message arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, just as Harold Mitchell was settling into his recliner with a cup of chamomile tea. 23 words that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his relationship with his son. "Dad, I've been thinking. I'm better off without you in my life. Please don't contact me anymore." Harold stared at the glowing screen, reading the message 3 times before the weight of it truly hit him. 32 years of fatherhood reduced to a late-night text dismissal. But what his son didn't know was that Harold Mitchell wasn't the broken old man he appeared to be, and by the time this story was over, Marcus would discover exactly what he'd thrown away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold set his phone down with trembling fingers, the ceramic mug slipping slightly in his grip as the reality settled in. The living room of his modest Chicago bungalow felt suddenly cavernous, filled with the echoes of 32 years of birthday parties, homework sessions, baseball games, and bedtime stories. Marcus had been his entire world since the day Diana left them both when the boy was barely 5 years old. Now, at 32, his son had decided that world was no longer worth inhabiting. The house around him seemed to mock his devastation. Family photos lined the mantelpiece above the fireplace, chronicling Marcus's journey from gap-toothed kindergartner to successful software engineer. Little League trophies gathered dust on the bookshelf, each one representing a Saturday morning Harold had spent cheering from aluminum bleachers. The refrigerator in the kitchen still displayed Marcus's college graduation photo, even though that milestone had been 4 years ago. Harold pulled himself from the recliner, his 64-year-old knees protesting the sudden movement. He walked to the window overlooking Maple Street, where streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk he taught Marcus to ride a bike on. The irony wasn't lost on him that this very house, this neighborhood, these memories Marcus was now rejecting had been built entirely around giving his son the stability Harold himself had never known growing up. The phone buzzed again, and Harold's heart leaped with the irrational hope that Marcus had reconsidered, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, he found a follow-up message that cut even deeper. "I know this seems harsh, but I need to focus on my own family now. Stephanie and the kids come first. You understand." Stephanie. Harold's daughter-in-law of 3 years, a woman who smiled politely at family gatherings but whose eyes never quite met his. The kids, his grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, ages 4 and 2, who called him Grandpa Harry and squealed with delight when he brought them picture books and toy trains. Harold sank onto the couch, the full implications of Marcus's decision washing over him like ice water. It wasn't just losing his son, it was losing access to his grandchildren, losing the future he'd imagined of teaching Tyler to throw a curveball and reading bedtime stories to Emma. It was the systematic erasure of his role in the family he'd spent his entire adult life building. The worst part was how completely blindsided he felt. Just 3 weeks ago, Marcus had called to ask for advice about a work situation. 2 months before that, they'd spent a Saturday afternoon together fixing the leaky faucet in Marcus's kitchen while Stephanie took the kids to her mother's house. There had been no warning signs, no gradual cooling of their relationship, no obvious conflict that might have precipitated this nuclear option. Harold retrieved his reading glasses from the side table and examined the messages again, looking for clues he might have missed. The language was formal, almost clinical, like Marcus had drafted it multiple times before sending. The timestamp showed he'd sent it late at night, after Stephanie and the kids would have been asleep. Had this been a spontaneous decision made in the darkness of insomnia, or had Marcus been planning this rejection for weeks, maybe months? The silence of the house pressed in around him. Harold lived alone and had for the past 15 years, ever since Marcus left for college. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, filled his days with woodworking projects in the basement workshop, volunteer work at the community center, and weekly dinners with his son's family. Now, that carefully constructed routine felt pathetically empty. What was the point of building birdhouses if there was no one to give them to? What was the purpose of maintaining his health and independence if his family didn't want him around to enjoy it? Harold walked to his home office, a small room off the main hallway that he'd converted from Marcus's childhood bedroom. The space still held traces of its former life, holes in the wall where teenage posters had once hung, marks on the doorframe tracking his son's height year by year. Now it housed Harold's computer, filing cabinets full of important documents, and shelves lined with technical manuals from his 40-year career as an electrical engineer. He powered up his laptop, the blue glow illuminating his weathered face in the darkness. Something about Marcus's message nagged at him beyond the obvious pain of rejection. The phrasing was too clean, too final, too unlike the son he'd raised. Harold had spent 4 decades solving complex problems, diagnosing electrical systems, and troubleshooting equipment failures. His engineering mind refused to accept that a relationship could simply short-circuit without warning. Harold opened his email and scrolled through months of correspondence with Marcus. Work updates, family photos, requests for advice, invitations to dinner. Nothing in their recent communications suggested any underlying tension or resentment. If anything, Marcus had seemed more attentive than usual, calling every few days and including Harold in family activities with unusual frequency. The laptop's clock showed 12:23. Harold had been staring at his son's rejection for over half an hour, and the initial shock was beginning to transform into something else: determination. As an engineer, he'd learned that when a system failed unexpectedly, the answer was usually found in careful analysis of the components, the connections, and the external factors that might have influenced the breakdown. Harold created a new document and began typing, his methodical nature taking over where his emotions had left off. He started with a timeline, documenting every interaction he'd had with Marcus and his family over the past 6 months. Dinners, phone calls, text exchanges, birthday parties, random visits. Each entry received a timestamp and a brief description of the mood, topics discussed, and overall tone of the interaction. The pattern that emerged was puzzling. If anything, Marcus had been more engaged with Harold recently, not less. He'd called more frequently, invited Harold to more family events, and seemed genuinely interested in his father's opinions on everything from home improvement projects to career decisions. There had been no arguments, no moments of tension, no signs that Marcus was building toward this dramatic severance. Harold leaned back in his desk chair, studying the timeline he'd created. Something wasn't adding up. In his experience, people don't make major life decisions in isolation, especially decisions that involve cutting family ties. Marcus was married, which meant Stephanie was likely involved in this choice. They had 2 young children, which meant stress levels in their household were probably high. They were both working professionals with demanding careers, which meant time and energy were constantly stretched thin. The more Harold thought about it, the more he suspected that Marcus's sudden rejection wasn't really about Harold at all. It was about something else, some external pressure or influence that had convinced his son that removing his father from the equation would somehow solve a different problem entirely.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Harold opened a new browser window and navigated to Marcus's social media profiles. His son wasn't particularly active online, but occasionally posted photos of family outings or work achievements. Harold scrolled through the past few months of posts, looking for anything that might provide insight into Marcus's state of mind. The photos told a story of apparent happiness. Marcus and Stephanie at a company party, both smiling widely for the camera. The kids playing in their backyard sandbox, covered in sand and grinning with pure joy. Family vacation pictures from a trip to Wisconsin Dells showing everyone laughing on water slides and posing with cartoon characters. But Harold's trained eye noticed details that others might miss. In the more recent photos, Marcus's smile looked forced, not reaching his eyes the way it had in earlier pictures. Stephanie appeared increasingly polished and posed, her natural expressions replaced by what looked like carefully curated presentations. Even the kids seemed more subdued in recent images, their spontaneous joy replaced by the kind of behavior that suggested they were being coached to smile for the camera. Harold saved several of the photos to his computer, then cross-referenced them with his own timeline. The shift in body language and expressions seemed to coincide with a period about 4 months ago when Marcus had briefly mentioned that Stephanie was going through some changes but had declined to elaborate when Harold asked for details. The house creaked around him as the night settled deeper. Harold glanced at the clock and realized he'd been researching for over 2 hours. His tea had gone cold, abandoned on the side table next to his recliner. His back ached from hunching over the laptop, and his eyes burned from staring at the screen. But for the first time since receiving Marcus's devastating message, he felt something other than helpless despair. Harold had spent his career diagnosing problems that stumped other people. He'd been called in to troubleshoot electrical systems in manufacturing plants, office buildings, and residential developments when standard solutions failed. His reputation had been built on his ability to look beyond the obvious symptoms and identify the root causes of complex failures. Now he was going to apply those same analytical skills to the most important problem he'd ever faced. Marcus's rejection wasn't the malfunction, Harold realized. It was a symptom of something else, something that had influenced his son's decision-making process in ways that Marcus himself might not fully understand. Harold saved his research files and closed the laptop. Tomorrow, he would begin a more systematic investigation. He would treat this like any other engineering problem, gathering data, testing hypotheses, and working methodically toward a solution. Because Harold Mitchell had spent 40 years refusing to accept that complex problems couldn't be solved with enough patience, intelligence, and determination. As he turned off the office lights and headed toward his bedroom, Harold made a promise to himself and to the memory of the relationship he'd thought he had with his son. He would find out what had really driven Marcus to this decision. He would identify the external factors that had convinced his son he was better off without his father. And then Harold would make sure Marcus understood exactly what he was giving up. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Harold's mood as he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and yesterday's newspaper. The sports section lay open to an article about the Cubs' latest losing streak, but Harold's attention was elsewhere. He'd slept poorly, his mind cycling through fragments of memories and half-formed theories about Marcus's sudden rejection. Harold's phone sat silent on the table beside his breakfast plate, its black screen reflecting the overhead light. He'd checked it 17 times since waking up, hoping for some follow-up message from Marcus, perhaps walking back the finality of his late-night declaration. But the device remained stubbornly quiet, as if it too had accepted that the relationship between father and son had been terminated with corporate efficiency. At 64, Harold had thought he was beyond surprise when it came to life's capacity for delivering unexpected blows. He'd buried his parents, survived a bitter divorce, raised a child alone through the tumultuous teenage years, and built a successful career in an industry that changed constantly. Each challenge had required adaptation, patience, and methodical problem-solving. This situation would be no different, except for the stakes involved. Harold pushed aside his half-eaten toast and pulled out a legal pad he'd retrieved from his office. At the top of the first page, he wrote Marcus Mitchell, Behavioral Analysis, in his precise engineering handwriting. Below that, he created 3 columns: Historical Baseline, Recent Changes, and External Factors. Under Historical Baseline, Harold began documenting what he knew about his son's normal patterns of behavior. Marcus had always been deliberate in his decision-making, sometimes frustratingly so. As a child, he would research summer camp options for weeks before making a choice. In high school, he'd spent months comparing colleges before settling on his preferred engineering program. Even his proposal to Stephanie had been planned with military precision, complete with backup locations in case of weather and a photographer hidden in the bushes. This sudden text message rejection was completely out of character for the methodical young man Harold had raised. Marcus might eventually decide to limit contact with his father, but he would typically do so gradually, after multiple conversations and careful consideration of all parties involved. The abrupt finality of his message suggested either an emotional crisis or external pressure that had overwhelmed his usual analytical nature. Harold moved to the recent changes column and began listing everything he'd observed about Marcus's behavior over the past 6 months. The increased frequency of their contact, which had seemed positive at the time, now took on a different significance. Had Marcus been trying to spend more time with his father because he knew it was going to end, or had someone been encouraging those interactions for reasons Harold didn't yet understand? There was also the matter of Marcus's financial situation. Harold knew his son earned a good salary as a senior software developer, and Stephanie worked part-time as a graphic designer. They lived in a nice suburban neighborhood, drove reliable cars, and seemed comfortable without being extravagant. But Harold had noticed that Marcus had been asking more questions about Harold's retirement savings and investment portfolio during their recent conversations. Harold set down his pen and walked to the window, overlooking his small backyard. The rain had intensified, turning his carefully maintained garden into a soggy mess. He'd planned to spend the day planting the tomato seedlings he'd been nurturing in his basement. But the weather had made that impossible. Perhaps the forced indoor time was a blessing in disguise, giving him the opportunity to focus entirely on understanding Marcus's decision. The engineering approach to problem-solving required eliminating variables and testing hypotheses systematically. Harold returned to his legal pad and began developing a list of possible explanations for Marcus's behavior. At the top of the list, he wrote Stephanie's influence and underlined it twice. Harold had always maintained a polite but somewhat distant relationship with his daughter-in-law. Stephanie was pleasant enough during family gatherings, but she seemed to view Harold as an obligation rather than a welcome addition to their lives. She rarely initiated conversations with him, deflected his attempts to develop a closer relationship with his grandchildren, and had a habit of scheduling family activities when she knew Harold wouldn't be available. Initially, Harold had attributed Stephanie's coolness to the normal adjustment period that occurred when someone married into an established family dynamic. Marcus and Harold had been a tight-knit team for so many years that it was understandable for a new spouse to feel like an outsider. Harold had assumed that time and patience would eventually warm their relationship. Now he wondered if Stephanie's reserve had been more calculated than he'd realized. Perhaps she viewed Harold not as a future ally, but as competition for Marcus's attention and loyalty. Young couples often went through phases where they prioritized their new nuclear family over extended relationships. But the timing of Marcus's rejection seemed too coincidental to be coincidental. Harold flipped to a fresh page and began documenting everything he could remember about Stephanie's family background. She'd grown up in an affluent suburb north of the city, the daughter of a successful investment banker and a real estate attorney. Her parents are still married, still wealthy, and still very involved in their adult children's lives.
They'd paid for Stephanie's college education, helped with the down payment on Marcus and Stephanie's house, and regularly contributed to their grandchildren's college funds. By contrast, Harold lived modestly on his pension and Social Security, supplemented by careful investments he'd made throughout his working years. He was financially secure but not wealthy, comfortable but not extravagant. His gifts to Marcus's family were thoughtful rather than expensive. His contributions to family expenses practical rather than lavish. Could Stephanie's rejection of Harold be rooted in simple class consciousness? Was she embarrassed by her father-in-law's middle-class lifestyle when compared to her own family's affluence? Harold had noticed that Stephanie's parents were rarely mentioned in conversations, despite their obvious financial support for the young family. Perhaps Stephanie preferred to maintain separate spheres of influence, keeping Harold's modest background from interfering with her aspirations for social mobility. Harold's phone buzzed with an incoming text message, and his heart jumped with hope before he saw that it was from his neighbor, Eleanor Chen, asking if he needed anything from the grocery store. Harold replied with thanks but declined the offer, then stared at the device as if willing it to deliver better news. The silence stretched on, amplifying the sound of rain against the windows and the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Harold had never realized how quiet his house was until he was forced to confront the possibility that it might remain quiet permanently. No more surprise visits from Emma and Tyler. No more calls from Marcus asking for advice. No more family dinners where 3 generations gathered around Harold's dining room table. Harold returned to his analysis, driven by the need to understand what had happened to his family. Under external factors, he began listing influences that might have pressured Marcus toward his decision. Stephanie's family topped the list, but Harold also considered Marcus's work environment, their social circle, and any financial pressures they might be facing. Marcus worked for a technology consulting firm that prided itself on hiring young, ambitious professionals who were willing to work long hours in exchange for rapid career advancement. The company culture emphasized innovation, efficiency, and results, often at the expense of work-life balance. Harold wondered if Marcus was facing pressure at work that was affecting his personal relationships, making him more susceptible to advice about simplifying his life by eliminating perceived complications. There was also the matter of Marcus and Stephanie's social circle, which consisted primarily of other young professional couples with small children. Harold had met some of these friends at birthday parties and graduation celebrations, and he'd been struck by how similar they all seemed. The men wore identical casual uniforms of khakis and polo shirts. The women favored expensive athleisure wear and carried designer handbags. And their conversations centered around property values, school districts, and vacation destinations. Harold couldn't remember meeting any of these couples who maintained close relationships with their parents or in-laws. In fact, elderly relatives were rarely mentioned except in the context of babysitting services or inheritance expectations. Perhaps Marcus's social environment had normalized the idea that successful young families were better off without the complications of intergenerational relationships. The rain continued to pound against Harold's windows as he worked through his analysis, filling page after page with observations, theories, and questions. By noon, he had compiled a comprehensive overview of the factors that might have influenced Marcus's decision, but he was no closer to understanding the specific trigger that had prompted his son's late-night text message. Harold made himself a sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen counter while reviewing his notes. The methodical approach was helping him process the emotional shock of Marcus's rejection, but it was also revealing how little he actually knew about his son's current life. Their regular phone calls and family dinners had provided a surface-level view of Marcus's world, but Harold realized he had no real insight into the daily pressures, conflicts, and influences that shaped his son's decisions. If Harold was going to solve this problem, he needed more information. He needed to understand not just what Marcus had decided, but why he'd decided it and who had helped him reach that conclusion. That meant Harold would have to do something he'd never done before in his relationship with his son. He would have to investigate Marcus's life from the outside, gathering intelligence like a detective rather than relying on the open communication they'd once shared. Harold washed his lunch dishes and returned to his office, this time opening his laptop with a sense of purpose. If Marcus wanted to cut off communication, that was his choice. But Harold Mitchell had spent 40 years refusing to accept that complex problems couldn't be solved with enough patience, intelligence, and determination. His son might be done with him, but Harold was far from done with this investigation. The afternoon stretched ahead of him, gray and wet, but full of possibility. Harold cracked his knuckles, adjusted his reading glasses, and began the most important research project of his life. By the time he was finished, Marcus would understand exactly what he'd chosen to throw away. And more importantly, Harold would understand exactly why his son had made that choice in the first place. Harold's investigation began with social media, but not his son's profiles. Instead, he focused on Stephanie's digital footprint, which painted a picture of carefully curated domestic perfection. Her Instagram account featured dozens of photos showcasing their home's interior design, Marcus's career achievements, and their children's developmental milestones. Each image was perfectly lit and artfully composed, presenting their family life as a series of Pinterest-worthy moments. But Harold's engineering eye noticed inconsistencies in the timeline. Photos supposedly taken on the same day showed different lighting conditions and seasonal decorations. Several images that were presented as candid family moments revealed evidence of professional photography, suggesting that Stephanie was investing significant time and money in maintaining her online image. More concerning were the comment sections beneath Stephanie's posts. Female friends and acquaintances regularly praised her for her independence, her success in balancing career and motherhood, and her ability to maintain such a beautiful home without help. The repeated emphasis on Stephanie's self-sufficiency seemed oddly specific, as if she was actively cultivating an image of someone who didn't need support from extended family. Harold screenshotted several comment threads where Stephanie had explicitly stated that she and Marcus were doing it all ourselves and were proud to be building their own family traditions without outside interference. The language was subtle but pointed, suggesting that accepting help from parents or in-laws was somehow a sign of weakness or failure. The deeper Harold dug into Stephanie's online presence, the more he understood about the social pressure she faced. Her friend group consisted primarily of upwardly mobile young mothers who competed fiercely in every aspect of domestic life. Their children attended the most exclusive preschools, their homes featured the latest design trends, and their family vacations required months of planning and significant financial investment. Harold found evidence of this competitive environment in a private blog that Stephanie maintained for her closest friends. The entries, which she accessed through an old link she'd shared on her public profile, revealed the intense pressure she felt to maintain appearances while managing the reality of raising two small children and supporting Marcus's demanding career. One entry, dated 3 months ago, stood out as particularly revealing. Stephanie had written about feeling judged by other mothers who seemed to have unlimited family support for childcare and household management. She described feeling like she was failing because she couldn't afford a full-time nanny like some of her friends, and she expressed frustration that Marcus's work schedule prevented him from taking on more domestic responsibilities. The blog post concluded with Stephanie's declaration that she was going to prove she could succeed without relying on anyone else, including family members who offered help out of obligation rather than genuine enthusiasm. Harold realized with growing clarity that his daughter-in-law viewed his involvement in their lives not as supportive, but as evidence of her own inadequacy. Harold printed out several of Stephanie's blog entries and added them to his growing file of evidence. The picture that was emerging showed a young woman under enormous social pressure to appear perfect while secretly struggling to maintain control over every aspect of her family's life. In that context, Harold's presence wasn't just unnecessary, it was actively threatening to the image Stephanie was trying to project. Harold's phone rang, interrupting his research. The caller ID showed Marcus's number, and Harold's heart rate accelerated as he answered. For a moment, he allowed himself to hope that his son was calling to apologize, to explain, to restore their relationship. Instead, Marcus's voice was formal and distant. "Dad, I need you to return the spare key to our house. Stephanie wants to change the locks anyway, but it would be easier if you just drop it off in our mailbox." The request hit Harold like a physical blow. The spare key had been given to him when Emma was born, a practical necessity and a symbol of his inclusion in their family unit. Now it was being revoked like a security clearance, another step in his systematic removal from Marcus's life. "Marcus," Harold said carefully, "can we talk about what's happening here? Yesterday you wanted me completely out of your life, and now you're worried about a house key?" "The key is Stephanie's concern," Marcus replied, his tone remaining professionally neutral. "She needs to feel secure in our home." Harold caught the implication immediately.
Stephanie didn't feel secure with Harold having access to their house, which suggested she viewed him as some kind of threat. But a threat to what? Their marriage? Their children? Their carefully constructed image of self-sufficient success? "Marcus, what exactly has Stephanie told you about me?" Harold asked directly. There was a long pause before Marcus responded. "This isn't about Stephanie, Dad. This is about me needing to focus on my own family's needs." The rehearsed quality of Marcus's answer confirmed Harold's suspicions. His son was repeating talking points rather than expressing his own feelings.
Someone had coached Marcus on how to handle this conversation, providing him with responses designed to deflect questions and avoid specific explanations. "I'll drop off the key," Harold said finally, recognizing that pushing for more information would only put Marcus on the defensive. "But I want you to know that this decision is going to have consequences you haven't considered." "What do you mean by that?" Marcus asked, and for the first time, his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Harold chose his words carefully. "I mean that removing someone from your life who has been supportive and involved doesn't just affect the present, Marcus. It affects the future in ways you might not anticipate." Another long pause. "I have to go, Dad. Please just drop off the key." The line went dead, leaving Harold staring at his phone. The conversation had been brief but informative. Marcus was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, suggesting that the decision to cut contact wasn't entirely his own. His concern about Harold's warning about future consequences indicated that he hadn't fully thought through the long-term implications of his choice. Most importantly, Stephanie's demand for the house key revealed her active role in orchestrating Harold's removal from their lives. She wasn't just supporting Marcus's decision, she was driving it, implementing practical steps to ensure that Harold couldn't maintain any connection to his son's family. Harold walked to his kitchen junk drawer and retrieved the spare key to Marcus's house. The small piece of metal felt heavier than it should have, weighted with memories of emergency visits when one of the children was sick, surprise deliveries of Harold's homemade cookies, and the simple comfort of knowing he could help his family when they needed him. As Harold pocketed the key for its final journey, he realized that Stephanie had made a critical error in her campaign to remove him from their lives. By demanding the return of the key, she had revealed that she viewed Harold as enough of a potential problem to require preventative measures. That suggested she had something to hide, something that wouldn't withstand Harold's continued involvement in their family. Harold returned to his computer with renewed determination. If Stephanie wanted to play strategic games, she was about to discover that she'd chosen the wrong opponent. Harold Mitchell had spent 40 years solving problems that other people couldn't handle. His daughter-in-law might have convinced Marcus to reject his father, but she had also given Harold the motivation he needed to uncover exactly what she was hiding. The rain had stopped while Harold worked, and late afternoon sunlight was beginning to filter through his office windows. Harold glanced at the clock and realized he'd been researching for 6 hours straight. His back ached, his eyes burned, and his coffee had gone cold hours ago. But for the first time since receiving Marcus's devastating text message, Harold felt like he was making progress toward understanding what had happened to his family. Harold saved his research files and backed them up to an external drive. Tomorrow, he would drive to Marcus's neighborhood and return the house key as requested. But he would also begin the next phase of his investigation, gathering intelligence about his son's daily life and the influences that had shaped his recent decision. As Harold prepared dinner in his quiet kitchen, he thought about the promise he'd made to himself the night before. He would find out what had really driven Marcus to reject him. He would identify the forces that had convinced his son he was better off without his father. And then, Harold would make sure Marcus understand exactly what he was giving up. The first step would be returning the key. The second step would be showing Marcus and Stephanie that Harold Mitchell wasn't the kind of man who disappeared quietly just because someone wanted him gone. Harold drove through Marcus's subdivision with the careful attention of a reconnaissance mission. The Springfield Heights development represented everything his son had achieved through hard work and careful planning. Manicured lawns stretched between colonial-style houses, each one variations on a theme of suburban prosperity. Children's bicycles dotted driveways, basketball hoops stood sentinel over pristine garage doors, and late-model SUVs gleamed in the afternoon sun. Marcus's house sat on Elmwood Drive, a corner lot that commanded a premium price but provided extra privacy. Harold had helped his son calculate the mortgage payments 3 years ago, proud that Marcus could afford such a substantial investment at just 29 years old. Now, as Harold parked across the street, the house looked like a fortress designed to keep him out rather than a home where his grandchildren played in the backyard. Harold pulled Marcus's spare key from his pocket and studied it one final time. The small piece of metal had unlocked more than just doors over the past 3 years. It had represented access, trust, and his role as an emergency contact for two small children who called him Grandpa Harry. Returning it felt like surrendering his place in the family structure that he'd helped build from the ground up. The mailbox stood at the end of Marcus's driveway, a decorative copper fixture that Stephanie had selected to match the house's exterior hardware. Harold approached it slowly, scanning the neighborhood for any sign of his son or daughter-in-law. The last thing he needed was an awkward confrontation that would only escalate the tension between them. As Harold lifted the mailbox lid to deposit the key, movement in the front window caught his attention. Emma, his 4-year-old granddaughter, was pressed against the glass, her small hands creating foggy prints on the pane. She waved excitedly when she spotted Harold, her face lighting up with the uncomplicated joy that only young children could express. Harold's heart clenched as he waved back, knowing this might be his last interaction with Emma for months or possibly years. She was too young to understand why Grandpa Harry was no longer welcome in their house, too innocent to comprehend the adult conflicts that had suddenly restricted her world to exclude one of the people who loved her most. The front door opened and Stephanie emerged with Tyler balanced on her hip. Tyler's 2-year-old grandson reached toward him with chubby arms, babbling something that sounded like Harry mixed with excited gibberish. Stephanie's expression was carefully neutral, polite but distant, like she was greeting a service technician rather than her children's grandfather. "Harold," she said, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy she might use with a stranger. Harold studied his daughter-in-law's face, searching for any hint of discomfort or guilt about the role she'd played in his banishment. Instead, he found only the composed confidence of someone who believed she was making necessary decisions for her family's benefit. Stephanie had convinced herself that removing Harold from their lives was not just justified but essential. "The children look well," Harold said carefully, not wanting to provoke a confrontation but unable to ignore Emma and Tyler completely. "Emma's gotten taller since I last saw her." Stephanie shifted Tyler to her other hip, a subtle movement that created more physical distance between Harold and his grandson. "They're both thriving," she replied. "We're keeping them very busy with activities and playdates." The implication was clear. Emma and Tyler's social calendar was full enough without visits from their grandfather. Stephanie was already working to fill the space that Harold's absence would create, ensuring that the children wouldn't feel the loss of his regular presence in their lives. Harold dropped the key into the mailbox and closed the lid with deliberate precision. "Stephanie, I hope you'll reconsider this decision. Marcus and I have never had any serious conflicts, and I've always tried to be supportive of your family's choices." Stephanie's composure never wavered. "Harold, this isn't personal. It's about what's best for our family's future. Sometimes that means making difficult choices about priorities and boundaries." There it was, Harold realized, the language of self-help books and marriage counseling sessions. Stephanie wasn't speaking from personal animosity, but from a philosophy that viewed family relationships as resources to be managed rather than bonds to be nurtured. She'd been taught, or had convinced herself, that successful families required strategic elimination of complications and outside influences. "What exactly do you think I've been complicating?" Harold asked directly. "I've babysat when you needed help, brought gifts on holidays, and stayed out of your parenting decisions. What boundary have I crossed?" Stephanie glanced back toward the house, where Emma was still visible in the front window. "It's not about specific incidents, Harold. It's about dependency patterns and enabling behaviors that prevent young families from developing their own strength and independence." There it was, Harold realized, the language of self-help books and marriage counseling sessions. Stephanie wasn't speaking from personal animosity, but from a philosophy that viewed family relationships as resources to be managed rather than bonds to be nurtured. She'd been taught, or had convinced herself, that successful families required strategic elimination of complications and outside influences. "What exactly do you think I've been complicating?" Harold asked directly. "I've babysat when you needed help, brought gifts on holidays, and stayed out of your parenting decisions. What boundary have I crossed?" Stephanie glanced back toward the house, where Emma was still visible in the front window. It's not about specific incidents, Harold. It's about dependency patterns and enabling behaviors that prevent young families from developing their own strength and independence. There it was, Harold realized, the language of self-help books and marriage counseling sessions. Stephanie wasn't speaking from personal animosity, but from a philosophy that viewed family relationships as resources to be managed rather than bonds to be nurtured. She'd been taught, or had convinced herself, that successful families required strategic elimination of complications and outside influences. "What exactly do you think I've been complicating?" Harold asked directly. "I've babysat when you needed help, brought gifts on holidays, and stayed out of your parenting decisions. What boundary have I crossed?" Stephanie glanced back toward the house, where Emma was still visible in the front window. "It's not about specific incidents, Harold. It's about dependency patterns and enabling behaviors that prevent young families from developing their own strength and independence." Harold felt a flash of anger at the clinical language being used to justify his exile. Stephanie was describing his love for his grandchildren and support for his son as psychological pathology, reframing his presence in their lives as somehow harmful to their development as a nuclear family unit. "Whose idea was it to frame my involvement that way?" Harold asked, his engineering mind focused on identifying the source of this perspective. "Because that doesn't sound like something Marcus would conclude on his own." Stephanie's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Marcus and I discuss all major decisions together. We both agreed that some changes were necessary for our family's growth." But Harold caught the defensive tone in her voice, the slight hesitation that suggested she'd revealed more than she intended. Someone had provided Stephanie with the theoretical framework she was using to justify Harold's removal. The question was whether that someone was a marriage counselor, a self-help guru, or something else entirely. Tyler began fussing in Stephanie's arms, reaching again toward Harold with obvious recognition and affection. The little boy's distress at being kept away from his grandfather was becoming difficult for Stephanie to ignore, undermining her narrative about what was best for the children's development. "I should get them inside," Stephanie said, backing toward the front door. "Thank you again for returning the key, Harold. I hope you understand that this is really for everyone's benefit." Harold watched his daughter-in-law retreat into the house, carrying Tyler away from him, while Emma remained pressed against the window. The little girl's confused expression broke Harold's heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. Whatever forces had convinced Marcus and Stephanie to cut him out of their lives, those forces were now affecting innocent children who had no voice in these adult decisions. Harold returned to his car and drove slowly through the subdivision, his mind processing the conversation he'd just had with Stephanie. Her language had been too polished, too theoretical, to represent her authentic feelings about Harold's role in their family. Someone had coached her on how to discuss boundary setting and independence building in ways that made Harold's banishment sound like enlightened family management rather than cruel rejection. Harold pulled into a parking space at a coffee shop several blocks from Marcus's neighborhood and took out his phone. If Stephanie was using therapeutic language to justify her decisions, then she's likely working with a counselor or therapist who specializes in family dynamics. Harold began searching online for marriage counselors and family therapists in the Springfield Heights area, looking for professionals whose approaches might align with Stephanie's newfound philosophy about eliminating family dependencies. The search results revealed several possibilities, but one name stood out immediately. Dr. Miranda Vaughn operated a practice called New Family Dynamics and specialized in helping young couples establish independence from what she termed generational interference patterns. Her website featured testimonials from clients who had successfully restructured their family boundaries and eliminated toxic dependency relationships with extended family members. Harold clicked through Dr. Vaughn's online materials with growing recognition. Her theoretical framework matched Stephanie's language almost exactly, describing grandparents and in-laws as potential threats to healthy nuclear family development. According to Dr. Vaughn's philosophy, young couples needed to prioritize their own family unit and resist the emotional manipulation of older relatives who used grandchildren as leverage to maintain inappropriate levels of control. The more Harold read, the angrier he became. Dr. Vaughn was essentially running a business that specialized in breaking up extended families, convincing young parents that loving grandparents were actually psychological threats to their children's development. Her approach pathologized normal intergenerational relationships, reframing grandparental involvement as evidence of unhealthy dependency rather than natural family bonding. "Whose idea was it to frame my involvement that way?" Harold asked, his engineering mind focused on identifying the source of this perspective. "Because that doesn't sound like something Marcus would conclude on his own." Stephanie's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Marcus and I discuss all major decisions together. We both agreed that some changes were necessary for our family's growth." But Harold caught the defensive tone in her voice, the slight hesitation that suggested she'd revealed more than she intended. Someone had provided Stephanie with the theoretical framework she was using to justify Harold's removal. The question was whether that someone was a marriage counselor, a self-help guru, or something else entirely. Tyler began fussing in Stephanie's arms, reaching again toward Harold with obvious recognition and affection. The little boy's distress at being kept away from his grandfather was becoming difficult for Stephanie to ignore, undermining her narrative about what was best for the children's development. "I should get them inside," Stephanie said, backing toward the front door. "Thank you again for returning the key, Harold. I hope you understand that this is really for everyone's benefit." Harold watched his daughter-in-law retreat into the house, carrying Tyler away from him, while Emma remained pressed against the window. The little girl's confused expression broke Harold's heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. Whatever forces had convinced Marcus and Stephanie to cut him out of their lives, those forces were now affecting innocent children who had no voice in these adult decisions. Harold returned to his car and drove slowly through the subdivision, his mind processing the conversation he'd just had with Stephanie. Her language had been too polished, too theoretical, to represent her authentic feelings about Harold's role in their family. Someone had coached her on how to discuss boundary setting and independence building in ways that made Harold's banishment sound like enlightened family management rather than cruel rejection. Harold pulled into a parking space at a coffee shop several blocks from Marcus's neighborhood and took out his phone. If Stephanie was using therapeutic language to justify her decisions, then she was likely working with a counselor or therapist who specialized in family dynamics. Harold began searching online for marriage counselors and family therapists in the Springfield Heights area, looking for professionals whose approaches might align with Stephanie's newfound philosophy about eliminating family dependencies. The search results revealed several possibilities, but one name stood out immediately. Dr. Miranda Vaughn operated a practice called New Family Dynamics and specialized in helping young couples establish independence from what she termed generational interference patterns. Her website featured testimonials from clients who had successfully restructured their family boundaries and eliminated toxic dependency relationships with extended family members. Harold clicked through Dr. Vaughn's online material.
According to Patricia's account, Dr. Vaughn had persuaded their daughter that accepting help with childcare from grandparents was a sign of personal failure and that maintaining close relationships with parents indicated an inability to function as an independent adult. Harold felt a chill of recognition as he read Patricia's review. Her description of Dr. Vaughn's methods matched almost exactly what appeared to be happening with Marcus and Stephanie. The therapist was systematically turning young parents against their own families, using psychological terminology to justify what amounted to emotional abuse of elderly relatives who had committed no crime other than loving their children and grandchildren. Harold scrolled through more online reviews and found a pattern of similar complaints. Dr. Vaughn's practice seemed to specialize in convincing young couples that their parents and in-laws were impediments to their success rather than sources of support. Her methods resulted in broken families, confused grandchildren, and elderly parents who couldn't understand why their loving relationships had suddenly been redefined as toxic interference. Harold closed his laptop and sat back in his car, processing the implications of what he discovered. If Marcus and Stephanie were indeed working with Dr. Vaughn, then their decision to cut contact with Harold wasn't really their decision at all. They were following the advice of a professional who had convinced them that Harold represented a threat to their family's psychological health.
That realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant that Marcus had been manipulated into rejecting his father by someone who claimed to be helping his marriage. Liberating because it meant that Harold wasn't fighting against his son's authentic feelings, but against the influence of a third party who had inserted herself into their family dynamics. Harold started his car and began driving home, his mind already working on the next phase of his investigation. If Dr. Vaughn was behind Marcus's sudden rejection, then Harold needed to understand her methods well enough to counter them. He needed to find other families who had been damaged by her approach and learn how they had fought back against her influence. Most importantly, Harold needed to document the harm that Dr. Vaughn's methods were causing to families like his own. If she was systematically destroying relationships between parents and adult children, then other people needed to know about the damage she was inflicting under the guise of therapeutic intervention. Harold's investigation was no longer just about salvaging his relationship with Marcus. It was about exposing a professional who was using her credentials to break up families for profit, leaving a trail of confused grandchildren and heartbroken grandparents in her wake. As Harold pulled into his driveway, he made a new promise to himself. He would not only prove that Dr. Vaughn's influence had damaged his family, but he would also make sure that other families were warned about her destructive methods. Marcus might have chosen to reject his father, but Harold would make sure his son understood exactly who had coached him toward that decision. Harold spent the evening researching Dr. Miranda Vaughn's practice with the systematic thoroughness that had made him successful as an electrical engineer. He created spreadsheets tracking her online reviews, documented her professional history, and began mapping the network of families who had been affected by her methods. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Dr. Vaughn targeted families where young couples were already experiencing stress from managing careers, small children, and financial pressures. She convinced these vulnerable parents that their difficulties stemmed from their inability to establish proper boundaries with extended family members who were supposedly undermining their confidence and independence. Harold found forum posts from grandparents who described experiences almost identical to his own. Adult children who had suddenly cut contact after beginning therapy with Dr. Vaughn, using language about boundaries and independence that sounded scripted rather than authentic. Grandchildren who were forbidden from seeing grandparents who had been loving and supportive throughout their lives. One post from a grandmother named Catherine Rodriguez described how her son had accused her of emotional manipulation after years of providing free childcare for her grandchildren. According to Catherine's account, Dr. Vaughn had convinced her son and daughter-in-law that accepting help from grandparents was preventing them from developing proper parenting skills and creating unhealthy dependency patterns in their children. Harold saved Catherine's contact information and several others, planning to reach out to these families to learn more about their experiences with Dr. Vaughn's methods. If he could document a pattern of harm caused by her therapeutic approach, he might be able to convince Marcus that he'd been manipulated rather than helped by his counseling sessions. Harold's research revealed that Dr. Vaughn charged premium rates for her services, often convincing couples to commit to months or even years of ongoing therapy to maintain their newly established family boundaries. Her practice generated significant revenue by pathologizing normal family relationships and creating ongoing dependence on her guidance to navigate the isolation she had helped create. Harold found financial records indicating that Dr. Vaughn's practice had grown by more than 300% over the past 3 years, suggesting that her message about family independence was finding a receptive audience among stressed young parents. Her marketing materials specifically targeted couples who felt overwhelmed by the expectations and opinions of their extended families, promising relief through strategic boundary setting and relationship restructuring. The more Harold learned about Dr. Vaughn's business model, the more he understood that she was essentially profiting from family destruction. She identified vulnerable young couples, convinced them that their families were sources of stress rather than support, and then charged them substantial fees to maintain the isolation she had helped create. Harold's phone rang at 10:30, interrupting his research. The caller ID showed Marcus's number, and Harold's heart rate accelerated as he answered. "Dad?" Marcus's voice sounded strained, uncertain. "Did you drop off the key today?" Harold could hear tension in his son's voice, suggesting that something had happened after Harold's visit to return the key. "Yes, I left it in your mailbox as requested. I spoke briefly with Stephanie and saw the children." There was a long pause before Marcus responded. "Stephanie said you seemed upset about the situation." Harold chose his words carefully. "I'm concerned about the sudden change in our relationship, Marcus. Yesterday we had a normal father-son relationship, and today I'm not welcome in your house. That's a significant shift that deserves some explanation." "I told you, Dad, I need to focus on my own family's needs." The rehearsed quality of Marcus's response confirmed Harold's suspicions about Dr. Vaughn's influence. His son was repeating therapeutic language rather than expressing his own authentic feelings about their relationship. "Marcus, are you and Stephanie working with a marriage counselor or family therapist?" Harold asked directly. Another long pause. "That's not really your concern anymore, Dad." But Harold caught the defensive tone in Marcus's voice, the same hesitation he'd heard from Stephanie earlier. They were indeed working with someone who had coached them on how to handle Harold's questions and challenges to their decision.
I'm asking because the language you and Stephanie are using sounds very specific, very clinical, Harold continued. It sounds like you've been given talking points about boundaries and independence rather than working through your own feelings about our relationship. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. You're trying to analyze and control the situation instead of just accepting my decision. Harold recognized the accusation as another piece of therapeutic language, probably something Dr. Vaughn had warned Marcus to watch for. Any attempt by Harold to understand or challenge their decision would be reframed as evidence of his manipulative behavior and need for control. "Marcus, I've spent 40 years solving complex problems by gathering information and analyzing systems. When something breaks down unexpectedly, I investigate the cause. Our relationship hasn't had any major problems, so I'm trying to understand what changed. What changed is that I grew up and realized I need to put my wife and children first," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Harold could hear the uncertainty beneath his son's defensive words. Marcus was struggling to reconcile his new therapeutic insights with his actual experience of their relationship. Dr. Vaughn had convinced him that Harold represented a threat to his family's development, but Marcus's lived experience contradicted that narrative. "Has this therapist or counselor given you specific examples of how my involvement in your life has been harmful?" "I'm not discussing my therapy with you," Marcus said quickly, confirming Harold's suspicions about Dr. Vaughn's role in their decision. "Fair enough," Harold replied, "but I want you to consider something, Marcus. If someone is convincing you to cut contact with people who love you, you might want to ask yourself who benefits from that advice." The line went quiet for nearly a minute before Marcus spoke again. "I have to go, Dad. Please don't make this harder than it already is." The call ended, leaving Harold with confirmation that Dr. Vaughn was indeed involved in Marcus's decision, but also with hope that his son was beginning to question the wisdom of his choice. Marcus's defensive tone and reluctance to discuss his therapy suggested that he wasn't entirely comfortable with the path he'd been convinced to take. Harold returned to his research with renewed determination. He now had confirmation that Dr. Vaughn was manipulating his family, and he had evidence that Marcus was struggling with the decision he'd been coached to make. Harold's next step was to gather enough information about Dr. Vaughn's destructive methods to present Marcus with irrefutable evidence of the manipulation he'd experienced. Harold opened a new document and began drafting a comprehensive report on Dr. Miranda Vaughn's practice, her methods, and the pattern of family destruction she'd left in her wake. By the time he was finished, Marcus would understand exactly who had convinced him to reject his father, and why that advice had been designed to benefit Dr. Vaughn rather than his family. The following morning, Harold began reaching out to other families who had been affected by Dr. Vaughn's methods. His first call was to Catherine Rodriguez, the grandmother whose son had cut contact after accusing her of emotional manipulation. Catherine's voice was heavy with pain as she described her experience. "It happened so suddenly," she said. "One day I was watching my grandchildren 3 days a week while my son and daughter-in-law worked, and the next day I was told that my help was preventing them from bonding properly with their children."
Harold took detailed notes as Catherine explained how Dr. Vaughn had convinced her son that accepting childcare from grandparents created dependency patterns that would harm both the parents and the children. According to the therapist's philosophy, young parents needed to struggle with childcare challenges on their own in order to develop proper parenting skills and family cohesion. The strangest part, Catherine continued, was how clinical my son became when he explained why they didn't need my help anymore. He used words like boundaries and codependency that he'd never used before in his life. It was like he was reading from a script. Harold felt a chill of recognition. Catherine's description of her son's sudden adoption of therapeutic language matched exactly what he'd experienced with Marcus. Dr. Vaughn was providing her clients with specific terminology to use when cutting contact with family members, making their decisions sound psychologically sophisticated rather than cruel. Harold's second call was to Robert Chen, a grandfather whose daughter had stopped bringing his grandchildren for visits after beginning therapy with Dr. Vaughn. Robert's experience included additional details about the therapist's methods that Harold found deeply troubling. Dr. Vaughn convinced my daughter that I was trying to undermine her authority as a parent, Robert explained. She said that when grandparents give gifts or treats to grandchildren, it's actually a form of manipulation designed to make the children prefer their grandparents over their parents. Harold was appalled by the twisted logic that could reframe a grandfather's love for his grandchildren as psychological manipulation. Dr. Vaughn was essentially pathologizing normal grandparent behavior, turning expressions of love into evidence of malicious intent. My daughter started questioning every interaction I had with my grandchildren, Robert continued. She accused me of trying to win their affection by bringing them toys and taking them for ice cream. She said I was competing with her for their love instead of supporting her role as their mother. Harold realized that Dr. Vaughn's methods were particularly insidious because they exploited the natural insecurities that many young parents felt about their ability to raise children successfully. By suggesting that grandparents were secretly undermining their authority, the therapist was amplifying existing anxieties and redirecting them toward family members who were actually trying to be supportive. Harold's third call was to Margaret Sullivan, whose son had accused her of being enmeshed in his family after she'd helped them through a difficult period when her daughter-in-law was recovering from surgery. Margaret's account revealed another aspect of Dr. Vaughn's destructive philosophy. She told my son that healthy families shouldn't need help from extended family members, Margaret said. She convinced him that asking for support from parents or in-laws was a sign of weakness and that truly independent couples should be able to handle all challenges on their own. Harold understood that Dr. Vaughn was promoting a form of family isolationism that left young couples without the support systems that had traditionally helped families navigate difficult periods. By convincing parents that accepting help was a sign of failure, she was creating additional stress and pressure that would likely drive them back to her practice for ongoing therapeutic support. Each conversation Harold had with affected families revealed new aspects of Dr. Vaughn's methods, but the pattern was consistently destructive. She identified vulnerable young couples, amplified their existing insecurities about family relationships, provided them with clinical language to justify cutting contact with loving relatives, and then charged them substantial fees to maintain the isolation she had helped create. Harold compiled detailed notes from each conversation and began organizing them into a comprehensive report documenting Dr.
Vaughn's systematic approach to family destruction. The evidence was overwhelming, but Harold knew that presenting it to Marcus would require careful strategy. His son had been coached to interpret any criticism of his therapy as evidence of Harold's manipulative behavior. Harold's research also revealed that Dr. Vaughn's practice was part of a larger trend in family therapy that emphasized individual nuclear family units over extended family relationships. This philosophy appealed to young couples who felt overwhelmed by the complexities of managing relationships with parents, in-laws, and extended family members. But it often resulted in isolation and loss of crucial support systems. Harold spent the afternoon documenting the financial aspects of Dr. Vaughn's practice. Her website advertised intensive family restructuring programs that could cost upwards of $10,000 over the course of a year. She encouraged clients to view this investment as essential for their family's psychological health, creating ongoing dependency on her guidance to maintain the boundaries she had helped establish.
Harold realized that Dr. Vaughn had created a business model that profited from family destruction. She convinced young couples to cut contact with loving relatives, charged them substantial fees for the privilege, and then required ongoing therapy to maintain the isolation she had created. Her clients became financially and emotionally dependent on her guidance, while losing the natural support systems that had previously helped them navigate life's challenges. As evening approached, Harold reviewed the evidence he had compiled about Dr. Vaughn's destructive methods. He had documented her pattern of family destruction, gathered testimony from affected families, and identified the financial incentives that drove her practice. The question now was how to present this information to Marcus in a way that would help him recognize the manipulation he had experienced. Harold knew that direct confrontation would likely backfire, causing Marcus to become more defensive about his therapeutic experience. Instead, Harold needed to find a way to plant seeds of doubt that would encourage Marcus to question Dr. Vaughn's advice on his own. The key was helping Marcus recognize the contradictions between his lived experience of family relationships and the clinical framework he'd been taught to apply to those relationships. Harold's phone rang just after 9 o'clock, and he was surprised to see Marcus's number on the caller ID. This was the second call in 2 days, suggesting that his son was struggling more than he'd admitted with the decision to cut contact. "Dad?" Marcus's voice was quieter than it had been the night before, less certain. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday." Harold felt a spark of hope but kept his voice neutral. "What aspects of it have you been considering?" "You asked about specific examples of how your involvement had been harmful," Marcus said slowly. "I've been trying to think of actual incidents, and I'm having trouble coming up with concrete examples." Harold's heart rate accelerated. Marcus was beginning to question the therapeutic narrative he'd been given, recognizing that his actual experience with Harold doesn't match Dr. Vaughn's characterization of their relationship as harmful or manipulative. "That's an interesting observation," Harold said carefully. "What do you think that might mean?" There was a long pause before Marcus responded. "I don't know. Maybe I need to think about this situation more carefully." Harold recognized this as a crucial moment in their relationship. Marcus was beginning to doubt the wisdom of his decision, but he was also vulnerable to retreating back into the defensive posture that Dr. Vaughn had taught him. Harold needed to encourage his son's questioning without appearing to pressure or manipulate him. "Marcus, I want you to know that whatever you decide about our relationship, I'll always love you and want what's best for your family. But I also think it's important for you to make decisions based on your own experience rather than on theoretical frameworks that might not apply to your specific situation." "What do you mean by theoretical frameworks?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. Harold chose his words carefully. "I mean advice that sounds psychologically sophisticated but doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of your actual relationships. Sometimes professional guidance can be helpful, but sometimes it can also create problems where none existed before." Marcus was quiet for nearly a minute before responding. "I need to think about all of this, Dad. This whole situation has been more complicated than I expected." "Take all the time you need," Harold said. "I'm not going anywhere and I'm not going to pressure you for a decision, but I am here whenever you're ready to talk." After Marcus hung up, Harold felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since receiving his son's initial rejection. Marcus was beginning to question the therapeutic advice he'd received, recognizing that his lived experience contradicted the clinical narrative about Harold's harmful influence. The door to reconciliation wasn't open yet, but it was no longer completely closed either. Harold returned to his computer and began refining his report on Dr. Vaughn's destructive methods. If Marcus continued to question his decision, Harold wanted to be ready with comprehensive information about the manipulation his son had experienced. The evidence was damning, and Harold was confident that once Marcus understood how he'd been coached toward rejection, he would recognize the need to rebuild their relationship. Harold worked late into the night, driven by hope that his methodical investigation might soon reunite him with his son and grandchildren. Dr. Vaughn had convinced Marcus to reject his father, but Harold's engineering approach to problem solving was about to expose the flaws in her destructive philosophy. The battle for his family was far from over, but Harold finally felt like he was making progress toward victory. Harold's phone rang at 7:15 on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after Marcus had first rejected him. The early hour was unusual for his son, who typically called in the evenings after putting the children to bed. Harold answered immediately, sensing urgency in the timing. "Dad, we need to talk," Marcus said without preamble. His voice carried a tension that Harold hadn't heard since Marcus was a teenager dealing with high school drama. "Can you meet me for coffee this morning, somewhere neutral?" Harold's pulse quickened. After weeks of investigation and 2 brief phone conversations where Marcus had begun questioning his decision, this request for a face-to-face meeting represented a significant development. "Of course. Where would you like to meet?" "The Brew House on Main Street, 9 o'clock. The Brew House was a coffee shop halfway between Harold's house and Marcus's neighborhood, the kind of place where business meetings and casual conversations happened at equal frequency.
The choice of location suggested that Marcus wanted privacy for whatever conversation he was planning to have. Harold arrived 15 minutes early and chose a corner table that would provide privacy while allowing him to watch the entrance. He ordered black coffee and forced himself to remain calm despite the anticipation churning in his stomach. This meeting could represent the beginning of reconciliation, or it could be Marcus's attempt to provide a more detailed explanation for his decision to maintain their separation. Marcus walked through the door at exactly 9 o'clock, scanning the room until he spotted Harold. His appearance was disheveled in a way that was completely unlike his normally meticulous grooming. His hair looked unwashed, his shirt was wrinkled, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Most telling was his posture, slumped and defeated rather than carrying the confident bearing Harold remembered from their last few interactions. Marcus approached the table slowly, as if each step required conscious effort. He sat down across from Harold without making eye contact, his hands fidgeting with his car keys in a nervous gesture that reminded Harold of Marcus's childhood anxiety during difficult conversations. "You look like hell," Harold said gently, abandoning any attempt at small talk. "What's going on?" Marcus finally met his father's eyes, and Harold was shocked by the pain he saw there. His son looked like someone who had been wrestling with impossible decisions for weeks without finding any satisfactory answers. "I made a mistake, Dad," Marcus said quietly, "a big one." Harold felt a surge of relief mixed with concern. Marcus was ready to acknowledge that his decision to cut contact had been wrong, but something had clearly happened to bring him to this realization. Harold suspected that whatever had occurred involved Dr. Vaughn or Stephanie, or possibly both. "What kind of mistake?" Harold asked, keeping his voice neutral despite his burning curiosity. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion that made him look older than his 32 years. "I've been seeing a therapist with Stephanie, Dr. Miranda Vaughn. She convinced us that cutting contact with you was necessary for our family's psychological health." Harold felt a mix of vindication and anger. His investigation had correctly identified Dr. Vaughn as the source of Marcus's decision, but hearing his son confirm the manipulation was both satisfying and infuriating. "What changed your mind about her advice?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his untouched coffee cup. "Yesterday, Dr. Vaughn suggested that we should also limit Emma and Tyler's contact with Stephanie's parents. She said that any grandparent relationship created unhealthy dependency patterns, and that truly independent families shouldn't rely on extended family for emotional or practical support." Harold immediately understood the significance of this development. Dr. Vaughn had overplayed her hand by targeting Stephanie's wealthy parents, who provided substantial financial support for Marcus's family. Unlike Harold, who could be dismissed as a working-class inconvenience, Stephanie's parents represented resources that Marcus and Stephanie couldn't afford to lose. "How did Stephanie react to that suggestion?" Harold asked. "She was furious," Marcus replied. "She accused Dr. Vaughn of not understanding our specific family dynamics and said that some grandparent relationships were healthy and supportive. She insisted that her parents were different from you because they provided practical help without emotional manipulation."
Harold felt a flash of anger at the implication that his emotional support for his family constituted manipulation, while Stephanie's parents' financial support was somehow pure and uncomplicated. But he also recognized that Stephanie's defensive reaction to threats against her own family relationships had finally opened Marcus's eyes to the double standard they'd been applying. "That must have been a difficult realization," Harold said carefully. Marcus nodded, his expression growing more pained. "I started thinking about all the reasons Dr. Vaughn had given us for cutting contact with you, and I realized that most of them could apply equally to Stephanie's parents. They give expensive gifts to the kids, they offer unsolicited advice about parenting, they have strong opinions about how we should manage our finances, but somehow, when Dr. Vaughn suggested limiting contact with them, it felt completely wrong." Harold watched his son work through the logical inconsistency that had been hidden from him by his emotional investment in Dr. Vaughn's therapeutic framework. Marcus was discovering that the same behaviors that had been characterized as harmful when performed by Harold were suddenly acceptable when performed by Stephanie's family. "What did you conclude from that observation?" Harold prompted. "That maybe Dr. Vaughn's advice wasn't based on objective analysis of family dynamics," Marcus said slowly. "Maybe she was just telling us what we wanted to hear about the relationships that felt complicated while ignoring the obvious problems with the relationships we wanted to preserve." Harold felt proud of his son's analytical thinking, even as he grieved for the weeks of separation that could have been avoided if Marcus had applied that same logic earlier. "Did you discuss these concerns with Dr. Vaughn?" Marcus's expression darkened. "I tried to. I asked her to explain why contact with your parents should be limited while contact with Stephanie's parents could continue. She said that every family situation was different and that I should trust her professional judgment about what was best for our specific circumstances." Harold recognized this response as a classic deflection technique used by manipulative people when their inconsistencies are exposed. Dr. Vaughn had refused to provide logical justification for her contradictory advice, instead falling back to her professional authority to avoid acknowledging the flaws in her reasoning. "How did that answer sit with you?" Harold asked. "It didn't," Marcus replied. "It felt like she was avoiding my question because she didn't have a good answer. So I started researching her background and her methods." Harold's heart rate accelerated. If Marcus had conducted his own investigation into Dr. Vaughn's practice, he might have discovered some of the same troubling information that Harold had uncovered.
"What did you find?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Harold a series of screenshots. Online reviews from other families who worked with her. Stories that sound almost identical to what happened with us. Adult children cutting contact with parents after Dr. Vaughn convinced them that grandparent relationships were psychologically harmful. Harold studied the screenshots, recognizing several of the reviews he'd discovered during his own research. Marcus had found the same pattern of family destruction that Harold had documented, the same complaints about Dr. Vaughn's methods, and the same accusations that she was systematically breaking up families for profit. "One review really got to me," Marcus continued, scrolling to a specific comment. A grandmother wrote about how her son accused her of emotional manipulation after years of providing free childcare. She said that Dr. Vaughn convinced her son that accepting help from grandparents prevented proper family bonding. "It sounded exactly like the reasons I gave you for cutting contact." Harold felt a surge of sympathy for his son, who was clearly struggling with the realization that he'd been manipulated by someone he'd trusted to help his family. That must have been difficult to read. "It was devastating," Marcus admitted. "I started questioning everything Dr. Vaughn had told us about healthy family boundaries and independence. I realized that most of her advice was designed to isolate us from people who genuinely cared about our welfare." Harold reached across the table and placed his hand over his son's. "Marcus, you were trying to do what you thought was best for your family. Dr. Vaughn took advantage of your good intentions and used your trust to manipulate your decisions." Marcus looked up with tears in his eyes. "But I hurt you, Dad. I said terrible things about our relationship and accused you of being manipulative when you've never been anything but supportive. I cut you off from Emma and Tyler when you're one of the most important people in their lives." Harold felt his own eyes welling up with emotion.
You made a mistake based on bad advice from someone who was supposed to be helping you. That doesn't make you a bad person or a bad son. It makes you someone who was deceived by a professional who betrayed your trust." They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the emotional weight of the conversation. Harold felt relief that Marcus had recognized the manipulation he'd experienced, but he also felt anger toward Dr. Vaughn for the pain she'd caused his family. The therapist had systematically destroyed their relationship for her own financial benefit, leaving both father and son to deal with the emotional wreckage of her destructive methods. "What happens now?" Marcus asked eventually. Harold considered the question carefully. While he was grateful that Marcus had recognized his mistake, he also knew that rebuilding their relationship would require more than just acknowledgement of Dr. Vaughn's manipulation. They needed to address the underlying vulnerabilities that had made Marcus susceptible to her influence in the first place. "I think we need to understand how this happened so we can prevent it from happening again. Dr. Vaughn identified something in your family situation that made you vulnerable to her suggestions. If we can figure out what that was, we can address it in healthier ways." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Stephanie and I have been under a lot of stress lately. Work pressures, financial concerns, the challenges of raising two small children. Dr. Vaughn seemed to offer simple solutions to complicated problems." Harold understood that Dr. Vaughn had exploited the normal stresses of young parenthood, convincing Marcus and Stephanie that their difficulties stemmed from family interference rather than the natural challenges of their life stage. By providing a scapegoat for their problems, she had offered the illusion of control over circumstances that were largely beyond their immediate influence. Complex problems rarely have simple solutions, but they do have manageable components that can be addressed systematically. That's something we can work on together, if you're willing. Marcus smiled for the first time since sitting down. "I'd like that, Dad. I've missed having your perspective on difficult situations." Harold felt a wave of gratitude that his methodical investigation had helped preserve the possibility of reconciliation. His engineering approach to problem-solving had identified the source of their conflict and provided the information Marcus needed to recognize the manipulation he'd experienced. "There's something else we need to discuss," Harold said carefully. "Dr. Vaughn's influence on other families. I've been researching her practice, and she's done this to dozens of families. Someone needs to expose her methods before she destroys more relationships." Marcus's expression grew serious. "What do you have in mind?" Harold pulled out his own phone and showed Marcus some of the documentation he'd compiled. "I've been in contact with other families who were affected by her methods. Their stories are remarkably similar to yours. If we could convince some of them to come forward, we might be able to file complaints with the state licensing board." Marcus studied Harold's research with growing amazement. "Dad, this is incredibly thorough. How long have you been working on this?" "Since the day after you cut contact," Harold replied. "I knew something was wrong with your decision, so I started investigating. When I identified Dr. Vaughn as the likely source of your change in attitude, I began documenting her pattern of family destruction." Marcus shook his head in wonder. "You never gave up on me, even when I explicitly told you to stay out of my life." "I never give up on people I love," Harold said simply. "That's not a character flaw, despite what Dr. Vaughn might have told you." They spent the next hour reviewing Harold's research and discussing strategies for exposing Dr. Vaughn's destructive practices. Marcus was particularly interested in contacting other affected families, both to support their healing processes and to build a stronger case against the therapist. "I need to talk to Stephanie about all of this," Marcus said as they prepared to leave. "She's been defending Dr. Vaughn, but I think she'll understand once she sees the evidence of the pattern." Harold felt cautiously optimistic about Stephanie's potential reaction. While she had been instrumental in implementing Dr. Vaughn's advice, she had also reacted defensively when the therapist had targeted her own family relationships. That suggested she might be capable of recognizing the double standard they'd been applying. "Take your time with that conversation," Harold advised. Stephanie invested a lot emotionally in Dr. Vaughn's approach. Learning that she was manipulated might be difficult to accept. Marcus nodded. But it's important that she understands what happened. We can't move forward as a family if we don't acknowledge how we got derailed in the first place. As they walked to their cars, Marcus stopped and turned to face his father. Dad, I know it's going to take time to rebuild the trust I damaged, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, even when I was convinced that cutting contact was the right decision. Harold felt his throat tighten with emotion. I never doubted that you loved me, Marcus. I just knew that something was preventing you from expressing it in healthy ways. I'm glad we figured out what that something was. They hugged for the first time in weeks, and Harold felt the first real hope he'd experienced since receiving Marcus's devastating text message. The road to complete reconciliation would be long and complicated, requiring careful rebuilding of trust and communication. But the most important step had been taken. Marcus had recognized the manipulation he'd experienced and chosen to prioritize his authentic feelings over the therapeutic framework that had been imposed on their relationship. That afternoon, Harold received a text message from Marcus that simply read, "Emma and Tyler are asking when Grandpa Harry is coming to visit again. How about this weekend?" Harold stared at the message for several minutes, hardly believing that his exile from his grandchildren's lives was ending so quickly. Harold's response was equally simple. "I'll be there." 2 days later, Harold stood on Marcus's front porch, holding a bag of books and toys he'd accumulated for his grandchildren during their forced separation. The door opened before he could knock, and Emma burst out to wrap her arms around his legs. "Grandpa Harry!" she squealed with pure joy. "Daddy said you were coming to play with us." Tyler appeared in the doorway, followed by Marcus, who was holding his youngest son and grinning widely. Stephanie emerged last, her expression cautious but not hostile. She'd clearly been briefed on Harold's research into Dr. Vaughn's methods, and while she wasn't ready to apologize for her role in his banishment, she wasn't actively opposing his return either. "Harold," Stephanie said politely, "thank you for being patient with us while we worked through some family issues." Harold appreciated that Stephanie was making an effort, even if her language was still somewhat clinical. Rebuilding their relationship would take time, but the fact that she was willing to have him in her home represented significant progress from her previous position. "Family issues can be complicated," Harold replied diplomatically. "I'm just glad we found a way to work through them together." The afternoon passed pleasantly, with Harold reading stories to Emma and helping Tyler build elaborate towers with wooden blocks. Marcus and Stephanie seemed more relaxed than they had in months, as if removing Dr. Vaughn's toxic influence from their lives had lifted a weight they hadn't fully realized they were carrying. During a quiet moment while the children napped, Marcus showed Harold the formal complaint he'd drafted for the state licensing board. The document detailed Dr. Vaughn's pattern of manipulating vulnerable families, her use of inconsistent standards for evaluating family relationships, and her financial incentives for maintaining client dependence on her guidance. "I've been in contact with 3 other families who are willing to file similar complaints," Marcus said. "Catherine Rodriguez, Robert Chen, and Margaret Sullivan have all agreed to document their experiences for the licensing board review." Harold felt proud of his son's initiative in organizing other victims of Dr. Vaughn's methods. Marcus had transformed his personal experience of manipulation into a broader effort to protect other families from similar harm. "The licensing board takes multiple complaints very seriously," Harold said, "especially when they show a pattern of professional misconduct that crosses ethical boundaries." Stephanie joined their conversation, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I've been reading the research you compiled about Dr. Vaughn's practice," she said to Harold. "I had no idea that she'd done this to so many other families." Harold studied his daughter's expression, recognizing genuine remorse beneath her carefully controlled demeanor. "She's very skilled at identifying vulnerable families and exploiting their insecurities. You and Marcus were dealing with normal stresses that she reframed as evidence of dysfunctional family dynamics." "I feel like such an idiot," Stephanie said quietly. "I was so convinced that she was helping us become stronger as a family. I never considered that she might be creating problems instead of solving them." Harold felt sympathy for Stephanie's position. Dr. Vaughn had targeted her insecurities about managing work and family responsibilities, convincing her that accepting help from Harold represented personal failure rather than normal family support. The therapist had turned Stephanie's natural desire to be a good mother into a weapon against her own family relationships.
Dr. Vaughn is a professional manipulator, Harold said gently. She's trained to identify people's vulnerabilities and exploit them for her own benefit. Recognizing that you were deceived doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. Stephanie's composure cracked slightly, and Harold saw tears forming in her eyes. I cut you off from your grandchildren because a stranger convinced me it would make me a better mother. How do I forgive myself for that? Harold reached across the table and placed his hand over Stephanie's. By learning from the experience and making different choices going forward. By protecting other families from experiencing what we went through. By rebuilding the relationships that Dr. Vaughn tried to destroy. Marcus put his arm around Stephanie's shoulders, offering comfort as she processed the emotional weight of recognizing the manipulation she'd participated in. Harold felt hopeful that this crisis might ultimately strengthen their family bonds by forcing them to examine and recommit to their core values. The following week brought news that the state licensing board had opened a formal investigation into Dr. Vaughn's practice. Marcus's complaint, combined with similar reports from other families, had provided enough evidence of professional misconduct to warrant a comprehensive review of her methods and client outcomes. Harold received a call from Detective Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in financial fraud cases. She explained that several former clients had filed complaints alleging that Dr. Vaughn had used deceptive practices to maintain long-term financial dependency on her services. We're looking at potential charges of consumer fraud and professional misconduct, Detective Walsh explained. Dr. Vaughn appears to have systematically misrepresented the nature of normal family relationships in order to generate ongoing revenue from vulnerable clients. Harold provided Detective Walsh with his comprehensive research on Dr. Vaughn's methods, including documentation of her pattern of family destruction and the financial incentives that drove her practice. The detective was impressed by the thoroughness of Harold's investigation and the quality of evidence he'd compiled. Most families affected by this kind of professional misconduct never file complaints because they're too embarrassed or confused to understand what happened to them, Detective Walsh said. Your systematic approach to documenting the pattern may be the key to stopping Dr. Vaughn from harming more families. 3 months after Marcus's initial rejection, Harold stood in a courtroom watching Dr. Miranda Vaughn face professional discipline for her destructive practices. The state licensing board had found clear evidence of ethical violations, including the use of inconsistent therapeutic standards, exploitation of client vulnerabilities for financial gain, and systematic damage to family relationships without legitimate therapeutic justification. Dr. Vaughn's license was suspended pending completion of extensive additional training in family therapy ethics. Her practice was closed, and she was required to provide full refunds to clients who had been harmed by her methods. Several civil lawsuits were pending from families seeking compensation for the emotional damage her manipulative practices had caused. Marcus and Stephanie sat beside Harold in the courtroom, holding hands as they watched justice being served for the manipulation their family had experienced. Emma and Tyler were with Stephanie's parents, who had become allies in the effort to rebuild healthy family relationships after learning about Dr. Vaughn's destructive influence. I can't believe we paid her thousands of dollars to convince us to reject people who loved us, Stephanie whispered as Dr. Vaughn was led out of the courtroom. Harold felt satisfaction at seeing professional consequences for Dr. Vaughn's harmful behavior, but his primary emotion was gratitude for the restoration of his family relationships. The crisis had ultimately made them stronger by forcing honest examination of their values and priorities. After the hearing, the extended family gathered at Harold's house for dinner. 3 generations sat around his dining room table, sharing stories and laughter as if the painful separation had never occurred. Emma and Tyler competed for Harold's attention, bringing him drawings they'd made and insisting that he read their favorite books multiple times. As evening approached and Marcus prepared to take his family home, Harold reflected on the lessons learned from their ordeal.
Dr. Vaughn had nearly succeeded in destroying their family bonds by exploiting normal stress and insecurity. But Harold's methodical investigation had exposed her manipulation and provided the evidence needed to restore their relationships. "Dad," Marcus said as they stood in Harold's doorway, "I learned something important from this whole experience. When someone tries to convince you to cut ties with people who love you, that's usually a sign that their advice isn't in your best interest." Harold smiled at his son's hard-won wisdom. "That's a valuable lesson, Marcus. I hope you'll remember it if anyone ever tries to manipulate your family relationships again." Stephanie stepped forward and hugged Harold warmly. "Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we didn't deserve your patience. You saved our family from making a terrible mistake." As Harold watched his son's car disappear down Maple Street, he felt profound gratitude for the engineering mindset that had served him throughout his career and ultimately saved his most important relationships. Problems could be solved with enough patience, intelligence, and determination. Even problems involving professional manipulation and family destruction. Harold's phone buzzed with a text message from Emma, sent from Marcus's phone. It was a photo of a crayon drawing showing a gray-haired stick figure labeled Grandpa Harry surrounded by smaller figures labeled Emma, Tyler, Daddy, and Mommy. At the top of the page, Emma had written, "My family," in uneven letters. Harold saved the image and smiled, knowing that this simple drawing represented the most important victory of his life. Dr. Vaughn had tried to convince his family that he was a threat to their happiness and development. Instead, Harold had proven that love, patience, and methodical problem-solving could overcome even professional manipulation designed to destroy family bonds. The crisis was over, but the lesson would last forever. When someone told Marcus he was better off without his father, Harold had made sure his son discovered exactly what that loss would mean. And in the end, the love between them had proven stronger than any therapeutic framework designed to tear them apart. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.